Let's have a look at some of these familiar faces. What do these people have in common? Athlete, singer, royal figure, politician. What do they all have in common? They have all struggled with mental illness at some point. Mental health and mental illness. We hear these terms being used, but what do we really know about them? Mental illness doesn't discriminate based on age, gender, race, religion, socioeconomic background, or occupation, which means that you and I, and the person next to you, none of us are above it. In a series of national surveys, information was gathered on the lifetime prevalence of mental disorders in Australia. We're talking about the whole spectrum of disorders, ranging from depression to psychotic disorders. Can you guess what was found? Between the ages of 16 to 85, one in how many Australians will develop a mental illness at some point in their lives? What do you think this number is? Who thinks it's 1 in 25,000? 1 in 10,000? 1 in 1,000? 1 in 100? 1 in 50? 1 in 10? 1 in 2? The answer is almost 1 in 2. How do you feel about that number? Take a moment to have a think. Did you guess right? This is obviously a much more serious issue than we think it is. Now let's have a think here. 1 in 2. That would make up half of the population. If we have 100 people in this room, 50 of us would have had this problem or will be facing it. Is this congruent to what you know of people in your lives? Do you know of someone struggling? It obviously expands far beyond just that one person you might be aware of. Now, how about children and adolescents? A national survey found that 1 in 7 children and adolescents between the ages of 4 to 17 will experience a mental illness during this formative period. It is likely that this number is underreported because half of all mental illnesses that people will experience at some point in their lives would occur by the age of 14. Over 75% of mental illnesses will occur by the age of 25. One of the major problems that we don't talk about enough is suicide. Suicide is the leading cause of death for Australians between the ages of 15 to 49. Far more people die by suicide than in road accidents. So, if the rates are as such, why don't we know more about mental health and mental illness? Why is there still so much stigma and shame attached to mental illness? When people think about a person with a physical injury or condition, we are generally wired to demonstrate empathy and care towards them. Mental illness is a mental injury or condition. And just because we can't see the wound or the pain doesn't make it any less of a struggle or any less debilitating for the person. The stigma attached to mental illness is often centered around the idea of personal choice and control. People tend to assume that a person struggling with mental illness can make a choice to not be this way or to just snap out of it. Now, we wouldn't say that to someone battling cancer or nursing a broken arm, would we? Likewise, a person struggling with mental illness would, if they could. Mental illnesses are illnesses of the brain that can be caused by or contributed to by biological changes or chemical imbalance in the brain. It is not simply a matter of choice. It is not uncommon for people struggling with mental illness to report feeling stigmatized and ashamed. Have a look at some of these terms that get casually thrown around when describing mental illness. Let's take a few seconds here. Have a look at some of these words. Turn to the person next to you and try using one of these words in a sentence on them, like this. you are mental. Take a moment to think about how that felt. I bet some of you felt insulted. Some of you didn't feel good about it at all. Now imagine a person already struggling with mental illness who is feeling vulnerable and scared when self-confidence is at a very low point. Imagine how it would feel hearing some of these comments being said. You can imagine how much that impact would be on them, and if you felt uncomfortable, you can imagine that the impact could easily be magnified many times over. So why do people use such demeaning language when describing mental illness? Perhaps it's the lack of understanding that mental illnesses are real illnesses. Just like medical conditions, mental conditions can also be treated and people can recover from them. A person with a broken arm is so much more than their injury. Likewise, a person with mental illness is so much more than their illness. In general, we need to ask for help to receive help. Unfortunately, stigma and shame have been found to be major deterrents to seeking treatment. When a person feels ashamed, guilty, responsible, helpless, and stuck, it makes it so much harder to ask for help. In fact, young people have been found to be less likely than any other age group to seek support for mental illness. Have a think about the language we looked at a little earlier when describing mental illness. Instead of using such language, how about replacing them with, "Are you okay? I'm here if you need to talk. You are not alone." These sentences are far more powerful and validating than all of the previous sentences combined. So, what causes mental illness? It is often a combination of biological, psychological, and social factors, many of which are not within the person's control. Biological factors, including genetic susceptibility, hormones, changes in the brain mechanisms. Psychological factors, including grief and loss, stress, adjusting to change, unhelpful thinking patterns. Social factors, including social isolation, bullying, and unexpected events like COVID-19, which has affected each and every one of us. So how do we reduce the rates and prevent the occurrence of mental illness? By safeguarding our mental health. Not everyone suffers from mental illness, but everyone has mental health. This lady on the screen is my grandma. A couple of years ago, I went overseas to visit my family, and I spent the last day with my grandma. We had a really nice time together. She was doing really well. She was happy and healthy. I took the red-eye flight back to Brisbane, and when I arrived, I received news that she had unexpectedly passed away that morning. It was devastating news to receive because of the shock of having just seen her and having to fly back on the same day to attend her funeral. I spent the months following going through the grief process. Some days were harder than other days. Some days were more difficult to cope than other days. What made all the difference for me was being surrounded by love and support from family and friends, from the allowance that I tried to give to myself to stop and catch my breath, to take a second to check in with myself, to listen to what I need in the moment, to gradually find meaning in my own time and in my own way. We all go through stress and challenging life events. It's an unavoidable part of life. Can anyone in this room say that they've never had a bad day? Can anyone say that they've never felt overwhelmed? Can anyone say that they've never experienced a loss? Can anyone say that they've never felt hurt and upset? Think about how these moments felt. Did you feel fatigued, lost, drained, on edge, defeated, or perhaps alone? Our minds don't work in isolation of our bodies. Think about these challenging moments. Was it just that bit harder to concentrate, to complete tasks, to hold a conversation, to sleep? We all go through periods of struggle. It is part of the human experience. But it's not just during significant events like personal loss where we should pay attention to our mental health. It's in the everyday stress. It's in the experience that makes us human, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's in the understanding that there is absolutely no shame in asking for help when we need help. Some of you might be wondering, I'm a clinical psychologist. I should be accustomed to hearing and seeing experiences and stories like these. From a professional standpoint, perhaps, but as a fellow human being, I too am navigating life like everyone else. What made all the difference for me during this difficult time was being surrounded by support. But not everyone has this support network. For instance, some of the adolescents from refugee backgrounds that I had the privilege of meeting in the process of doing my doctoral research. As a part of the research, we looked at predictors of academic achievement in adolescents from refugee backgrounds. We looked at academic factors such as English proficiency, whether students had formalized schooling and mode of instruction in their home countries, whether students had prior exposure to certain subjects before arriving in Australia. We also looked at psychosocial factors such as level of distress, trauma, and loss prior to migration, as well as level of social support and school connectedness after arriving in Australia. Interestingly, with the exception of English proficiency, none of the academic factors were found to predict academic achievement in adolescents from refugee backgrounds. The major predictors were found to be psychosocial factors, including level of distress, trauma, and loss prior to migration, as well as level of social support and school connectedness after arriving in Australia. Similarly, in studies conducted with mainstream student populations, psychosocial factors were also found to predict academic achievement. So, what does that tell us? Whether an adolescent achieves academic success, which subsequently projects them into success in adulthood, is largely dependent on the state of their mental health. Learning and excelling isn't just about the ability to take in the content at school. It's about feeling supported by people who believe in you. It's about feeling a sense of safety and a sense of belonging at school to be able to learn. It's about feeling motivated to want to be at school to learn. We are constantly reminded to listen to recommendations to take care of our physical bodies, to reduce the likelihood of developing medical conditions such as cardiac problems. We've all been told to maintain a balanced diet, to have regular exercise, to make sensible lifestyle choices. Likewise, we can manage the rates of mental illness by safeguarding our mental health. Has anyone heard of the term self-care? When most people think about the term self-care, what comes to mind? Is it ditching all your responsibilities and going for a full manicure and spa with your best friend? Is it having a big slice of chocolate cake after being very disciplined with your diet for a week? Is it lying in the sun and not caring about your homework that's due on Monday? Is it going and playing soccer with your friends all day and not calling home because you felt like it? If this is what first came to mind, you are not alone. A lot of people think that self-care is just self-indulgence and not caring about the world and only focusing on yourselves. And yes, self-care can indeed be all of those things, but it is so much more than that. It is not just a special reward, a privilege, something that we only deserve after we've managed to finish everything else. It is just as important as everything else. Think about the safety instructions that are given out when we take a plane ride. Might be a distant memory given the current climate that we're in with COVID-19. But have a think about the moment when the flight attendant is showing you how to put on your oxygen mask. You are instructed to first put on your own oxygen mask before you help others with their oxygen masks. We can't help someone else without first helping ourselves. We can't give if we don't have the capacity to give. Just like fuel that a car needs to keep running, we too need to regularly refill our tanks by taking care of our mental health. Take a moment to have a look at the different arms of this self-care circle. Have a think. It's not just in the big things, it's also in the little things. It's about staying connected. It's about giving yourself allowance to not be okay. It's about asking the person next to you, are you okay? It's about keeping up with enjoyable activities even when you feel like you don't have time for them. Well, particularly so when you feel this way. What little change will you start with today to start looking after your mental health? There is absolutely no shame in asking for help, because guess what? Remember the number 1 in 2. Think about this, 1 in 2. The person sitting next to you and the person sitting next to them might need that just as much too. Thank you.